to our event on food and environment, how to implement the transition towards sustainability. I'm Monica Postiglione, the Executive Coordinator of Turin School of Regulation and Fondazione per l'Ambiente. As you know, since March, we have shifted our activities online, and it seems that we will be forced to continue to carry on our moment of confrontation on environmental issues online, at least until the end of the year. But we really hope soon there will be the possibility to return to organize this kind of discussion in presence. This is the 5th of our online webinar, and I would like to thank the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo that supported the institutional activities of Fondazione per l'Ambiente and that made possible the organization of this webinar. Today we will talk about the relationship between food and environment and the possible strategies to implement the transition towards sustainability. The aim of the webinar is to analyze and deepen the link between sustainable food production, healthy environment, and public health, which today appears to be always more evident. Although in recent years in the European Union, much progresses have been made in the area of sustainability and safety of food production, this sector continues to be a major contributor of climate change and environmental degradation, and new efforts to reduce its negative impact are still needed. What is emerging in a very evident way is that the reduction of the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and as well as the protection of biodiversity and sustainable farming and animal health and a more sustainable food distribution are today necessary and urge action. Clearly, the transition towards sustainability in this sector implies the rethinking and reorganization of the entire food supply chain, a complex system which involves production, transport, distribution, and consumption of food products. And the restructuring of this system implies important productive, economic, logistic, and behavioral choices, and of course, the implementation of new strategies. Today's discussion intends to analyze and deepen the relationship between food production and environment, the policies insofar adopted, and the novelty and potentiality of recent development of the policies that the Green New Deal in the food sector in Europe, so what is happening in Europe, the possibilities linked to the adoption of different economic business models, such as the circular economy, and also the regulatory challenges that the adoption of these strategies means. We will discuss about these topics with 4 experts. Benjamin Bodirski, a senior scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He investigates long-term trajectories of the global food system and its impact on the environment. Michael Howard, Professor of Sustainable Supply Chain Management at the University of Exeter Business School. His current research examines food production systems and in particular how circular business models create value for business and society while protecting the environment. Marta Messa, she's director of Slow Food Europe. She has been working with slow food since 2010, and since 2014 she's based in Brussels, where she's working with the EU institution on policy relating to food, giving a platform to the international slow food networks and developing strategic partnership with other organizations active in Europe. And Lorenzo Berati, he's an associated professor of comparative private law at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Pollenzo, where from 2017 he teaches food law and European Union law. His current research and publication projects includes global food governance, international food trade law, and food consumer protection from a comparative perspective. So I'm very happy to welcome you all. Before to start our discussion, I would like to mention that there will be the possibility to ask questions to our speakers, and hopefully at the end of the events, we will have time to answer some of these questions. So for those of you who are interested in asking for a clarification on or other questions, please you can do that by using the Q&A chat. I pass to the second question, which is addressed to Marta Messa and concern the policies that have been implemented at the European level. We know that the food production and more in general the food sector is at the center of diverse policy at the moment in the in particular in the European Green New Deal. It has been there are many strategies that has been described and that are going to be implemented in the next years, and so I would like to ask you if you can describe us what is happening, what these policies are meaning, and in particular if you can tell us a bit more about the from farmer to fork strategies and what happened with the common agricultural policies that has just been discussed in the Parliament.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm happy to be discussing here today with you. Before I answer directly the question, I just wanted to say briefly, for those who do not know, slow food, it's a global movement. We were born 30 years ago, and we're now active in over 150 countries worldwide. And the goal of slow food is really to grant everyone's right to food that is good for them, good for the environment, and good for those who produce that food. So this is really in a nutshell, and we have a range of projects going from promoting cultivated biodiversity to promoting the exchange between citizens and farmers and cooks and so on, really to try to lead to more sustainable food systems at local and global level. In terms of the policies at European level, this year has been very interesting. We have a small office in Brussels. We've been here since 2014, really following much more closely the evolution of European policies dedicated to food. And it was a relief, if you want, this year when in May, the Commission published two key pieces of the Green Deal, namely the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. And I'm saying it was a relief because for the first time, there was really a talk of, or rather it was written black and white, that the European Union should aim towards sustainable food systems. For the first time, there was like the strategies that like Commission documents were talking about indeed the food system as a whole and not just the food supply chain. And so like the concept of sustainable food system became key and center. And specifically within the farm to fork, so it's a strategy, meaning it's now being discussed, and it will need to be, or rather different policies will need to be aligned with the farm to fork strategy, like the common agricultural policy, about which I will say a bit more afterwards. But it basically sets the direction of the European Union for the next 10 years, and it wants to give legislative tools to achieve sustainable food systems in the next 10 years. Now, of course, the challenge is that being a strategy, it has a set of proposals. These proposals will be put forward, and here I open a small parenthesis on how the European Union works, but they will be proposed by the European Commission and then debated and negotiated with two other key institutions in Brussels, namely the European Parliament, where there are members elected by us, citizens, and the Council of the European Union, which is the space where our national ministers meet and decide. And I think it's important to underline how decision-making happens, because often as citizens, we hear Brussels decided this or decided that, but there isn't such a thing as Brussels. Of course, a much better job can be done to be much closer to citizens, but our elected representatives play a key role in defining policies and in implementing them at national level. And I'm saying this also because it means that we as citizens can demand more, and especially of our elected representatives, and elect better next time around, if that is possible. So again, farm to fork strategy, legislative proposals, legislative tools for the next 10 years. And we were, as Law Food and as partner organizations that have been working with us on this, we were quite pleased with what was proposed in the farm to fork strategy, because just to mention a few of the targets, but there is a target to reduce by 50% the use and risk of chemical pesticides, and to reduce by the same amount by 2030 the use of more hazardous pesticides. There is a target to reduce nutrient losses by at least 50%, while ensuring that there is no deterioration in soil fertility. And that means also reducing the use of fertilizers by at least 20% by 2030. There is also a target about the reduction of antimicrobials for farmed animals and aquaculture, again, by 50% by 2030. And there is a target to reach 25% of agricultural land under organic farming by 2030. Now, these are just some of the more, if you want, relevant targets where we as Law Food and again as partner organizations, we might have wanted to see a bit more ambition, really to step seriously towards more sustainable systems. But then again, this was a very important stepping stone. Likewise, the biodiversity strategy goes absolutely in that direction, and it's all the more important as next year there is also the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So again, the European Union wants to be, so to say, a role model in terms of the commitments it makes in terms of biodiversity. And what I should also say is that it's finally in these two strategies, there is also mention of, for instance, agroecology. And now I want to say, as Law Food, we have an experience of 30 years working with farmers and local communities, really developing agroecological food system, local food system. What does that mean? That means farmers that work together with nature, who nourish nature, meaning they nourish the soil, the invisible biodiversity that is in the soil. They nourish the local ecosystems. They nourish, so it's not just about feeding, but nourishing the local communities. They maintain alive knowledge and traditions and know-how that has been developed over centuries. They create social bonds. They strengthen the local economy. And besides our experience that where we have many examples and stories, if you want, of successful local sustainable models that have been developed. There's now also a growing body of evidence showing that indeed agroecological models really help us fight climate change, help us make sure that farmers have fair revenues, and that make sure that citizens have access to healthy diets. So again, these two strategies, a very important stepping stone. What we've seen lately, and we got into a very heated debate in the last weeks, but because in the last weeks, essentially, the negotiations continued on the common agricultural policy. So this policy is the common policy in the European Union. It uses up this year 35% of the total budget of the European Union. So it's a very important amount of money. It's been indeed in negotiations, and there have been debates both at the level of our agriculture ministers and within the European Parliament. As Law Food, and again, in a broader coalition of civil society organizations, and this coalition is called the Food Policy Coalition. So, and we're aiming within that coalition to have greater integrity and coherence in food policies. But we've been pushing really for much higher ambition, not only on the environmental level, but also on the social level. And so we've been working really hard really to push for higher social standards and the fair treatment of all farmers and farm workers, which is a huge issue. If you look at how the pandemic highlighted how the European food system relies often on undocumented migrant workers picking our fruits and vegetables, that's something that we really need to improve if we want truly to talk about sustainability, because whilst the environment is absolutely a key pillar of sustainability, you also need social sustainability and social justice, as well as economic sustainability. So we've been pushing for much higher ambition. The pressure set by civil society generated such noise that at some point even the likes of Greta Thunberg spoke up and got very active on social media. And at one point, the demand was to take the CAP, so the Common Agricultural Policy, down, because there was by far not the same ambition as in the Farm to Fork strategy. And the same Frans Timmermans, who's the first vice president of the European Commission, who put forward, together with its colleagues in the European Commission, the proposal of the Farm to Fork strategy, basically just a couple of weeks ago said, I can pull the plug on the Common Agricultural Policy if the Parliament and the Council do not keep up the level of ambition of the Farm to Fork strategy. So now we are still awaiting for this last round of the negotiations between the Commission, Parliament and Council to get to the final text. In the meantime, national member states, so the European Union is made of 28 member states, each member state is now developing its national strategic plans, meaning translating into concrete measures the Common Agricultural Policy for their own country. And they're doing that in a negotiation with the Commission. We just actually hosted an event this morning about this with indeed representatives of the Commission, farmers from Slow Food, and the national ministries representatives to have an exchange about this. But so there is also the elaboration of these national strategic plans, which is again another way of putting into concrete terms the Common Agricultural Policy. So all in all, we have good strategies going on. There must be pressure from civil society, and there must be a strong dialogue, of course, between the decision makers and the farmers on the ground and civil society to decide what's the best way, what's the best course of action. On top of that, what we're also seeing is that of course, in the wake of the pandemic of COVID-19, a recovery fund was set up. It was just agreed basically a couple of weeks ago. It's about 10 billion euros for the period 2021-2022. And they specifically, well, 10 billion euros are specifically for the food sector, and 37% of those 10 billion euros are dedicated to organic farmers and measures for environment and climate action. 55% should go to support young farmers and the startups, and 8% is left at the discretion of member states. So again, more resources to help the EU food and agriculture sector develop more sustainably. Now, what I should say also that is very important as these debates are happening, there are two things. On one side, especially, well, not only here in the, I would say not only here in the Brussels bubble kind of world and media, unfortunately, the farmers are often depicted as one unique category without making a distinction between the different farmers that do exist and work in Europe. And so often the perception is that farmers are either against this higher environmental ambition or social ambition. And that is not the case. There are thousands, if not millions, of farmers in Europe as well as worldwide that have been practicing agroecology successfully for many years, that can bring a lot to the table, and that can really help other colleagues and embrace the transition towards more sustainable food and farming systems. So of course, you know, indeed, farming systems in Europe have been heavily influenced in the last 60 years by the Common Agricultural Policy that is still paying nowadays farmers according to how much land they own, and not so much in terms of what kind of production they have, whether they produce in respect of the environment, how they treat their workers. So of course, if you've set farmers up for a certain kind of production, it does take time to transition, but the examples are there, and there are many, and can really, you know, a stronger exchange between different farmers can enable this transition. The other thing I should say is that there are specifically two concepts that we need to keep our eyes open about. One is about the issue of needing to produce more food. It's a narrative that continues existing, but as the previous panelists presented, there is actually a much bigger issue of food waste. The issue is not so much producing more food. The issue is who has access to the resources to produce food. So who has access to the land, who has access to the seeds, who has access to water, who has access to the markets to sell that food. And if you look In Europe as well as elsewhere, you see that there is a concentration of market in the seed sector, there is a concentration of power in the food chain geared towards often the supermarkets. You see that like there's also been a concentration of land in the hands of fewer farmers in Europe. So this is also something that needs to be tackled, because then the issue is not, again, indeed how much we're producing. We're actually wasting a third at least of the food produced. And this is not even a full picture, because at least at European level, there is no measurement yet of food losses that happen at the field level, which is another big issue. So this narrative of like, we need to produce more to feed the world should be totally challenged, and we need to change perspective and re-democratize basically the access to resources so people can develop their own food systems. And the other issue is technology. Technology is absolutely a key element, but needs also to be democratic. We are very wary of discussions or statements where technology, especially like new GMOs or GMOs in general, can be a solution, can be, you know, the key to solve issues that we're facing. That is not the case. Also in the terms, at least of GMOs, we have sufficient evidence that they have not managed to solve any of the issues related to undernutrition or malnutrition worldwide. Neither have they met particularly good standards in terms of environmental performance. And again, the element of the human interaction with nature, of the human, you know, beyond what is happening in the environment, but the human, you know, the say that we have in the food we produce, how we produce it, and what we want to eat, needs to be there and needs to be recognized. So I think I'll stop here, but these were the main points I wanted to raise for my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, for your explanation of what is happening in the policy sector, but not only in the policy sector. Let's say that here in Europe, we have at the moment good strategies, but as you mentioned, the issues is more complex and involves also the rest of the world. So let's hope that also other countries will move soon in the direction of more sustainable food production. Now I would like to move on and to go to the third question, which is addressed to Michael Howard, and it's related to the role of the circular economy in the agro-food sector. As has been already mentioned, many things has to change in order to reach sustainability, and one of these is the economical model which is behind the production, but also the consumption. So can you please explain us how circular economy works and how this model can be used in this the food sector?
Thank you very much, Monica. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me first see if I can achieve the technological challenge of sharing my slides. So just bear with me just a few moments, and we'll see if we can get this started. So there we go, Alt-Tab, there we are, screen. There we go. So I hope you can all see this first slide, and allow me to introduce myself, Professor Mickey Howard, and I've been working at the University of Exeter for about 10 years now, looking at this question of how do we implement not just sustainable business, but how do we think about a new circular economy, and how does this affect this? So what I thought I'd do today would be to describe very briefly a project that I've been working on for the last 4 years, which was to look at circular economy in the context of the UK's agri-food sector. So my background, very briefly, is I used to work in the automotive industry, and then about 10 years ago, I had a major shift, and I realized that actually sustainable business was probably more important. So working on the sustainable and circular side. And when we started out 4 years ago, looking at this agri-food project in the south of England, we began to realize the importance of circularity really affects all aspects of industry and indeed social life. So this project, which I'll outline very briefly, looks at not just waste elimination, but this idea of recapturing value from closed loop supply chains, as well as creating a more resilient system that goes beyond the level of the firm. So we found all of these three aspects in this project. So by way of introduction, we were funded by one of our UK funding bodies for this piece of research. We engaged with 9 small firms in the dairy, baking and beverages sector, as well as all the farming community that supplied the milk and the dairy products for these small firms. And we had 2 questions. The first one was, how effectively can circular economy be applied to the food and farming sector? And how can these smaller firms access opportunities given their limited resources? And there's a sub-question here is, how does circular economy differ from sustainability and sustainable business? So this was a very practical project. It was quite rare to get academics and professors to get them out of their universities working with industry, but that's exactly what we tried to do here. So first of all, a little explanation of what is sustainability, and the traditional classroom definition is sustainability is something which combines social, economic and environmental concerns, and if your organization captures all 3, then you are a sustainable organization. This also is very similar to Elkington's triple bottom line. But of course, this is very difficult to achieve all of these in business. And so circular economy seems to be a more emerging vision. I think it seeks the same end, but the circular economy is a vision of a society where there's no waste or pollution, and you divide material flows into biological nutrients such as water and gas and foodstuffs, and technical nutrients, which are plastics, metal and paper. And if you divide out these nutrients, you can keep them circling for as long as possible, and you are copying nature, where nature has this cycle of rebirth and then reuse. Business starts to copy nature. So this is a vision of a restorative and regenerative system that's been designed by business. So why are we adopting circular now? Why is there such interest in circularity? Well, there are considerable opportunities. Across Europe, we estimated there were 1.8 trillion euros opportunities if you address the environmental and social challenges. Circular economy, it goes beyond simply the resource efficiency aspects and becomes much more of an effective solution. We're looking at systemic change. And we're seeing examples of circular economy in China, Europe, as well as the UK. Here in the UK, we have our own standards. So there's something very exciting that is offered by circular economy. Here at Exeter, we're talking about the circular business advantage. So for a long time now, when I teach this transition, how do we transition our supply chains from the traditional take, make and waste model, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where you throw away products at the end of their use. How do we make that transition to circularity? This is the question that engages me now. And I think it's because in the past, recycling wasn't seen as very sexy. I think many businesses felt that it wasn't adding value. And it's only recently, I think, that we've seen models such as the 3 Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle. They are now seen as core to business success. And so this transition to circular economy is not easy, but I think judging by the past presentations this afternoon, we have to do it. So back to our agri-food project, and the research method was very simple. We engaged with these small firms. We wanted to map the flows of waste and the current state of their picture. And by doing that mapping, we wanted to create scenarios for a future state where the process flow of materials, food waste, water, energy, and gases could be mapped to see how we could design it in a more effective way. So the picture down the bottom there is a picture of academics showing you how to model the hairnet, always an opportunity. So where we found then our starting point was to use very simple mapping processes. And this is not dissimilar to a lot of heavy industry. So we're using a value stream map to identify all the sources of bottlenecks, all the areas of waste. And here we've identified flows of water, which here the water was poured down the drain. This is for a dairy that was making cream. There was a lot of energy that was being wasted. And so this current state map was only achieved by researchers examining every aspect of the business. Also, if you look at the top left-hand corner here, we've got input from the farmers, trying to understand how the farmers transported their goods to this dairy plant. And when we had considered all the areas of waste, the future state was our scenario, which we recommended in terms of how would they close the loop in their material, water, and energy flows. And here you can see the use of particular technologies, such as heat exchangers, reusing energy. There's an anaerobic digester plant that was able to separate the water from the solid. So there's a lot of closing of the loops here, even some of the wet slurry being used back on the farmers' fields. And of course, some of this practice wasn't new, but I think it needed this project to connect together all of the best practice between the farmers and the dairies. Something else that we learned on this project was the traditional question of do you buy local or do you buy globally was very interesting. And a lot of the baked products which required wheat as part of the flour, we found that there simply wasn't enough material of that flour to buy it within the UK. We had to go to Europe, even the US, to import sufficient food. So whilst a lot of the baked products had local vegetables and legumes and meat, we still had to import a lot of our wheat from overseas. And so this global versus local isn't as simple as local equals good or global equals bad. It's more complex than that. One thing we were very anxious to do in this agri-food project was try to look beyond the level of the firm and start to connect up good practice between supply chains, but also look at the whole system, the whole region, in terms of who the key stakeholders were, the policymakers, even involve the customers as well. So taking this whole systems approach, we felt was quite innovative. And our tool for small firms was this idea to get all firms thinking about how they could embrace not just firm value, but think about the whole business, the benefits to society, and finally, full circular economy maturity was thinking about the whole ecosystem, the environment, the people, and the whole region. So the emphasis here is using circular economy to restore value to the whole system. It's not just about waste elimination. And in this final model that we came up with, our understanding of circular economy is where you connect together business value, societal value, as well as ecosystem value. And if you can do that, you are offering more resilience against price shocks, more resilience against waste. If these firms now have control over their own water systems and food returns, you're creating a much more resilient supply chain. So our new circular model is quite similar to sustainable business here, because we're trying to capture the societal and ecosystem elements, not just the business side. So very close towards the end, we have produced a number of outputs. The most interesting perhaps to the listeners this afternoon is a 20-minute video on how we approach this whole project. We have presented our findings to Westminster, to London, trying to convince the politicians that circular economy is is a viable business model. So I think I'll stop there. That was a very quick run through. In conclusion then, we think that we're beginning to show circular economy as a practical business tool that can appeal to both large and small firms, particularly in the agri-food sector. A number of enablers and barriers, but we feel now it's time to connect the good practice across the different sectors. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand control back to Monica.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And as you mentioned, it's not always easy to find a case study which can explain the main concept and a business model which can actually seems very good in connecting, as you were mentioning, the business, the society, the ecosystem, and the all together. So let's see what will happen in the future. But now I will go to the fourth question, which is addressed to Lorenzo Barati, and this is related to the regulatory challenges that all these policy we have been talking about, and these models that are going towards sustainability determine, because it's not always easy to match the regulation and the sustainability. So it's we would like to ask you how food safety and consumers protection regulation works within these policies, and so which are the challenges that we are finding. Please, Lorenzo, I leave you the floor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Monica. It is my pleasure to be here to participate to this so interesting meeting. And my perspective is the legal one. And at from the legal point of view, the issues you raised until now are very challenging, actually, because in the food sector's push towards greater sustainability, the laws and regulations, food law in general, both drives and hinders this progress, in the sense that while we have some pieces of legislation which seek to force food operators towards sustainability goals, to abandon some of the most harmful processes, on the other hand, we have food safety and consumer protection regulations, which may also impede moving food systems towards a circular economy. So in my presentation, I would like to tackle this issue. It is clear that also the Environment Commissioner Sinkevicius said some months ago that the main priority of European institutions traditional is food security, actually. While nowadays we have to consider also food sustainability, so it is necessary also to consider climate change, sustainability, biodiversity, and so on. And actually, this is very challenging from the legal perspective, because until now, food law is especially focused on food safety and consumer protection, but are pretty limited definition of what food safety and consumer protection is. In the sense that food waste, overconsumption, obesity, overall environmental footprint are not the main focus of food law. And in general, they are considered as different chapters of food law. So the focus is clearly outdated. So it will be necessary to pass and to reform, to pass new pieces of legislation with a new approach. I would like to develop my insights through some examples. The main pillar of the food safety law in Europe is the regulation 178/2002, which was passed, and it is the most important outcome of mad cow disease. And the idea of food safety includes acute ingestion-related risks such as microbial contamination from consumption of a single food item. But it does not include, for example, whole diet cumulative ingestion risks and also risks that arise from food production or disposal, the impacts before and after the point of ingestion, and so on. So the problem is that safety is about food and not sufficiently about the entire food system. So there is a kind of conflict between a narrow and a broad definition of food safety. And the problem is that food safety, nutrition, and environmental protection are considered as two different chapters. What is the consequence of it? The consequence is that in many cases, law currently is part of the problem and not part of the solution. The first immediate consequence of this narrow food safety definition is the production of food waste. There are environmental impacts which are unintended consequences. For example, because there is a removal of unsafe food from the human food stream, but the problem is that food safety regulation is overzealous. So sometimes the consequence is a superfluous food waste. For example, food removed from the human food chain is likely to be thrown away, even when it could be safely repurposed. Some examples. The typical example is in the labeling. Nowadays, we have a regulation about food labeling. And for example, we have the problem of food date labels, which exacerbate food waste, because there is a huge confusion among consumers between among the different expiration labels used by best before or other such labels have different purposes. Many people assume that they are the same thing, but they aren't actually. So the consequence is that if we do not distinguish use by and best before, we can assume that if the date of best before has passed, the food is unsafe and needs to be thrown away. And this obviously is not the case. It is not a problem only for consumers, but also for distributors, because nowadays it is difficult for them to sell products close to the best before date. There are promotional prices of sub-quality products which may help reduce food waste, but obviously it would be necessary that consumers should be familiarized with this practice. So the European institutions know very well this problem, so probably they are gonna change this piece of legislation by the end of 2022. But at the same time, we have to consider the fact that we are in a multi-layered system where there is a continuous interaction between the European institutions and member states, and also a continuous interaction between public and private subjects. So, for example, in this case, national legislation in some member states prohibits to sell food products after the minimum durability date. So the consequence is an increase of food wastage, obviously. A second example, withdrawals for food safety reasons. They are very important. Usually when we go to a supermarket, at the entrance, we find many different communications about these kinds of withdrawals. This is a good thing because it demonstrates that the system is accurate and it is very sensitive. But at the same time, it is important that recalls and withdrawals are targeted and accurate. And so at this regard, it is important to have accurate traceability systems. Traceability is another of the most important principles in food law. It is important because the more refined the traceability system is, the less food is wasted during a recall or withdrawal. There is a problem with a directive about lots, because the size of lots is not defined. It is left to member states and to producers. It is clear that the more, if the size of lots is high, it is possible to have a bigger amount of food waste in case of recall or withdrawal. So it is necessary to have a more effective governance approach. It is necessary to involve member states and also to involve producers and distributors in order to adopt small lot sizes, for example. Another problem, the problem of the aesthetic standard of fruit and vegetables in supermarkets. When we go to supermarkets, we can notice very easily that apples or carrots or tomatoes are all the same size, the same shape, the same color, appearance, and so on. It is a big problem because it is absolutely costly in terms of waste, obviously, and also in terms of rural development. This is a marketing standard, actually, because it used to be a public standard until 2011. In 2011, some of these public standards were abolished, but nowadays it is a private standard. So the final outcome is not so different. This is the reason why it is necessary also to consider that the responsibility is not only on institutions, but in general, it is necessary to have a multi-actorial approach. So these standards and buying systems of supermarket chains are, especially in some cases, against producers, especially small-scale producers. Another element which is important is about donation. In many cases, food donation is not so easy because they can be local safety laws which can prohibit or hamper the donation of food that is safe but is at or near its expiry date, and also because there are some states with strict liability laws for illness or damages caused by the consumption of food. So it is clearly necessary to have a change of perspective and a new approach, because it is clear that we cannot choose between food safety and sustainability. We cannot choose between consumer protection and sustainability. We have to somehow balance the different principles and the different needs. And it is absolutely not easy because we have to consider that different layers and different subjects are and should be involved also in the lawmaking activity. But in general, I think that the new approach of the European institutions should be that when a new piece of legislation is elaborated, before passing it, it is necessary to assess its impact on food waste prevention. And I think that until now, this hasn't been done sufficiently. It has not been enough. So these are the challenges. Another problem is that it is very difficult to monitor and to quantify the quantity, to measure the quantity of waste produced by the application of each piece of legislation, obviously because there are a lot of food operators involved in different food systems. It is clear that it is necessary to be very creative, because an only solution does not exist. So it is necessary to work on different issues, to consider more food systems from the perspective, from a collective perspective. And also it is, I think, and this is the end of my intervention, we have to consider more the term quality as used in the communication of food products. There is an abuse of the term quality. I think that in somehow it is necessary to decide that the term quality should be limited by saying that a quality product should demonstrate also to be not too unsustainable. And obviously, I think that we have also a very important role, because debates such as this one are very important to share experiences and perspectives. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. As you mentioned, regulation and law can be part of the problem and not always part of the solution. So let's hope it will soon change the situation also in relation to the new policies that are implemented, because otherwise there will be no space for real paths towards sustainability. So we still have 10 minutes left, and there are some questions. Some of these questions has been already answered, but I think the first question was related to the, I would say, accessibility to food, and the questions was related to the possibility of people of having access to a more sustainable diet. And I would like you all, I don't know who wants to answer this question, but at this point I will mention also some other questions that seems interesting. Another one is related to the Brazil, to the case of Brazil, where the exportation of food, it's an important economical revenues. So Gustavo Farina is asking how to deal the importance to protect nature with these economical issues, where the system incentivizes the producers to destroy nature to produce always more. And so I would add to this question also another aspects related to the incentives that can be structure in these policies that have been described before during the intervention of the panelists, because as we mentioned, circular economy seems a really good model to apply, that can be applied and used in many contexts, and so how it is possible to push toward this the adoption of this system. And then there is another question that it's by Valerio Zanghi. No, they're asking about other kind of diets based on fish, but also there was a question for Marta Strola. Okay, Marta Messa, I'm sorry, is the EU addressing properly the problem of seeds patterns in terms of food democracy and biodiversity protection? So these are, I think, if you want to try to answer to some of these questions, I leave you the floor. I see that it's quite complex and we have only a few minutes, but let's try. Who wants to be the first one?
I can start if you want, just from the very direct question on seeds. And now the EU is addressing that. There was just actually, what was it, like a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, there was a proposal to review the legislation, and actually the many pieces of legislations and laws that existed on seeds that didn't go through. And certainly, again, the biodiversity strategy is pointing the direction of granting better protection also of biodiversity and improving seed legislation. There is specific reference to that. And specifically about the point that Mrs. Zanghi raises on seed banks and countries being forced to grow GMOs. The problem in Europe we're facing at the moment is specifically about new GMOs. So new genomic techniques like CRISP and other techniques that basically like change the DNA of plants. And there, the specific request we have is that the European Commission follows the decision of the EU Court of Justice and essentially legislates or regulates these new GMOs under the current GMO legislation, which means they need to be traceable, they need to be labeled, so like we have the same safeguard systems in place that we have for GMOs. So that's the main thing. Thank you.
Shall I have a little tackle of the incentives and the business question? I think obviously this is a very complex issue. So I'm going to talk quite generally, I think, but it's clear that whatever we're doing at the moment with our food systems doesn't seem to be working very well. And there's a sort of perverse irony that in trying to set up with the common agricultural policy and the European Union, we've tried to provide a land of plenty. And in many cases, what we seem to have ended up with is excess obesity, still with pockets of poverty. In Cornwall, one of the areas of our study is the second poorest region in Europe. So there are significant challenges here. And I would appeal to this idea of thinking about how we create a level of change. There's no question that a radical step change is needed to reevaluate and rethink not just what we're eating, but how we incentivize business to behave in certain ways. So if I may, I would suggest that ideas such as circular economy could be the way forward, but whether you call it circular or sustainable, I think matters less. More that we start thinking about how there's a joined up solution where policymakers and business and local farmers start to think about how they can work together. And I think the bad old days of the 20th century, when everything was bounded within the level of the firm and it was all firm incentives, I think there has to be a much more joined up approach. This is something around circularity. Also thinking around systems resilience and resilience against price rises, droughts, climate change. If we can add all that into the equation as part of our well-being package for Europe, I think that is the way to start thinking in the future.
Yeah, I may also give an answer to the most general question, which was a bit about the solutions that we have. And I think one of the most important steps is to fix our economic system in the sense of the incentive structure. So we really have at the moment the problem, or we have the case that prices are the most important signal for our economic system, and these prices are not reflecting the actual value or damages that a product causes. So we can fix that, for example, through a tax, for example, a tax on greenhouse gas emissions or a tax on nitrogen surplus. And I think this is really important because it creates incentive throughout the whole food system to change behavior. I think taxes are very effective, in particular on the production side, so that circles are closed and that also interesting technologies are incentivized, and people and farmers who innovate have an advantage, a competitive advantage against people with unsustainable practices. But on the other side, on the consumer side, I'm not so positive that the price instruments will actually change a lot, because consumers are nowadays, at least in rich countries, not so much price driven anymore. One of the main parts there is rather things like convenience. And I think this is also an ongoing transformation that we see, is everything which increases in convenience is increasing. We are thinking of food delivery, to-go eating, gastronomy. All of these are strongly increasing, and this is maybe another thing, that we have to make healthy foods more convenient and unhealthy foods less convenient. We also have to think about advertisement restrictions for unhealthy and unsustainable food. So consumers are very complex, and I think a lot of different measures are there required. We also have to change the food environment. People, for example, need to have time at home for cooking. You could think even that something like the right to do home office can, of course, influence how many people are cooking at home and how these cooking skills increase. So very complex interactions, a lot of drivers that are responsible for the current change of diets that we cannot easily change. For example, more people are living in single-person households. In such cases, of course, it's much more difficult to cook. And it's also more difficult to reduce your waste because you're alone and things may easier go off. So also there, we actually face very complex problems where we may think about multi-generation housing or other things where we can actually find solutions to that. But as a researcher, I can say it's also an open question. So we are working on it.
Thank you very much. There is also, I don't know if we want to, there is another question for Lorenzo Bairati about food, about waste. I don't know if you want to give a short answer. It's quite a general question about the possible ways to reduce food waste.
I didn't read it, excuse me.
It's, would you mind giving a more depth explanation on what steps people should take in order to reduce food waste? So I suppose we don't have time for such huge questions, but we can.
There is a huge debate within the European institutions exactly about this issue. So what could be done for waste prevention or reduction at the level of, at the household level, at the level of consumers? So I think that it is important to follow this debate. It is very difficult to answer this question because it is very very broad. I think that there are many different pieces of information about it in the website of the European Commission, and each of them should deserve a debate per se.
Okay, so thank you very much for this answer. So now it's time to conclude. We are 2 minutes late, but I would like to thank you very much. You have been covering quite a lot of the interesting aspects of the complex discussion about food and environment. Thank you also to all the participants to the webinar. We believe in the importance of maintaining the discussion on environmental sustainability active and constantly open to all sectors of society, and because it's all this sector, we all have to monitor that the tools and the strategy to protect the environment are implemented in the best possible ways. So thank you all for being part of our activity, and stay safe and well.